In 1990, a teenage girl from Greyhaven, Oregon vanished without a trace, leaving her mother and father desperate for answers that would evade them for more than 2 decades. But 22 years later, as her father flipped through an old high school yearbook, what he noticed in that moment would change everything. The fog crept in from the vast Pacific Ocean, weaving silently into the early morning air, shrouding the sleepy coastal town of Greyhaven in its familiar mist. The thick gray veil blurred the jagged cliffs and dense pine forests that hugged the shoreline, muting the world into a quiet, secret place. Frank Sanders stood alone by the window of his daughter's childhood bedroom, eyes fixed on the swirling fog drifting around the distant lighthouse that marked the edge of the town. The rugged beauty of this place, the smell of salt in the air, the roar of the waves crashing far below, had once brought him peace and comfort. But that was before Alicia disappeared, before the world had grown silent, before hope had faded into shadows. Turning away from the window, Frank let his gaze sweep across the room frozen in time. The posters that once filled Alicia's walls still clung stubbornly to the paint, their colors faded but their shapes clear. Her desk, neatly arranged with textbooks and notebooks, remained untouched for all these years, waiting patiently for the future that never arrived. The closet still held rows of clothes, some she had worn only a handful of times, others untouched since the day she vanished, each piece a fragment of a life interrupted. "It's time," Frank whispered to himself, the words heavy with both resolve and grief. He remembered the conversation he and Elaine had shared the night before. After 22 years of living between hope and despair, they had finally agreed to accept that Alicia might never come home. Today, they would sort through her belongings, donate what could still bring joy to others, and tuck away the rest into the attic. Frank opened the window to let the sharp morning air inside. The room, filled with years of settled dust, stirred as particles danced in the sunlight. He sneezed softly, wiping his eyes. He moved to the closet, pulling out Alicia's clothes one by one. Each garment carried memory. Her favorite blue sweater, the dress she had worn to the junior prom, the worn jeans she had sewn patches onto herself. He folded them carefully, his mind flooding with images of the vibrant girl they had lost. As he worked, his hands brushed against a stack of textbooks and binders on the shelf. His fingers paused on a familiar book, a high school yearbook. Strange that he had never opened it before. In the days and weeks after Alicia disappeared, neither he nor Elaine could bear to look at her smiling face frozen in those pages. Faces of classmates who had moved on, who had grown up and left town, while their daughter remained missing. Sitting down on the edge of the bed, Frank opened the yearbook. The glossy pages felt heavier than he expected, as if holding all the years they had lost. He flipped carefully through the pages until he found Alicia's senior portrait. Her smile was radiant, filled with hope and promise, a sharp contrast to the ache that clenched Frank's heart. 22 years, he murmured, tracing her face with a trembling finger. "I have to learn to hold you in my heart without this pain, sweetheart." His eyes drifted to the photo beside hers, her best friend Amy Davidson. The memories flooded back. Sleepovers filled with laughter, whispered secrets shared under the covers, family dinners where the girls had made themselves at home. Frank realized he hadn't heard anything about Amy in years. After Alicia vanished, Amy had visited for a while, then the visits stopped. Curious, Frank flipped to the section with individual senior profiles. Each student had a page with a biography and personal quote. On Alicia's page he read the note she had written. "Thanks to Mom and Dad for always believing in me, to my teachers who pushed me to be better, and to my best friend Amy. Don't forget to return my book, The Secret Garden, Illustrated Edition. You old grandma. Love you forever." A small smile broke through Frank's sadness. That light-hearted jab was so like their friendship. He turned the page to Amy's profile, reading about her hopes and dreams, her fierce determination to follow her own path. The mention of The Secret Garden stirred something deep within Frank. Alicia had adored that book since she was a child, collecting every edition she could find. Had Amy ever returned it? Frank rifled through boxes of Alicia's books, but the illustrated edition wasn't there. His mind swirled with questions. Had Amy kept it all these years? On a whim, Frank flipped to the back of the yearbook, where students had written their contact information. Amy had scribbled her phone number, along with a note, "Call me anytime, BFF." Frank dialed, hope and hesitation tightening his chest. The call went to voicemail. The number was no longer in use. At that moment, the front door creaked open. Elaine entered, grocery bags in hand from the farmer's market. Her eyes widened at the scene. the scattered books and magazines covering their living room floor. "Frank, what is all this?" Her voice trembled with surprise, and something deeper, a pain he recognized. "I was going through Alicia's things, like we planned," Frank said softly, standing. Elaine's face hardened. "We agreed to pack things away, not to dredge the past again. I thought we were moving forward." "I'm not dwelling," Frank replied gently. "I found the yearbook. I was looking for something important." She pressed. Frank showed her the note about the book. Elaine sighed. "A book, Frank, it doesn't matter anymore. Alicia's things are just dust gathered." Frank changed the subject. "Do you know where Amy is now?" Elaine nodded slowly. "I see her sometimes in town. She lives in a camper these days. I think I'll visit her," Frank said, voice tentative. "Not just about the book. It's been so long." Elaine shook her head. "I can't, Frank. I'm not ready. Last night we agreed to let go of hope. Seeing Amy now feels like the opposite." She gestured to the mess. "I'll clean this up. You can go if you want." Frank nodded, guilt and determination mixing inside him. Elaine gave directions to the camper park where Amy usually stayed, cautioning him not to push her. As Frank gathered his things, he glanced back at Elaine carefully stacking Alicia's books. He felt a pang leaving her with the cleanup. The door shut behind him, the misty morning swallowing his figure as he drove toward answers hidden in the past. The rain had begun to mist lightly over the small town of Greyhaven. As Frank Sanders drove through its winding coastal road, the tires of his old sedan rolled steadily over damp pavement, weaving past weathered cabins, moss-covered fences and forgotten roadside motels, the same scenery he had passed 1,000 times. But today it all felt different. He held Alicia's yearbook on the passenger seat beside him like a sacred relic, one hand resting protectively on its worn cover. Elaine's directions led him just beyond the edge of town, to a modest stretch of land where several camper vans sat quietly along the wooded fringe of a narrow gravel lot. The rain painted everything in deeper shades of green and gray. Trees loomed overhead, their branches heavy with moisture, dripping rhythmically onto the campers below. Frank parked his car and took a deep breath. He could hear the soft hum of wind through the trees, the creaking sway of a hanging wind chime somewhere near. A man stood washing the windows of a beige RV. Frank stepped out of his car and approached cautiously. "Excuse me," he called out. "I'm looking for Amy Davidson. I was told she might live around here." The man glanced up, nodded, and gestured down the row. End of the lot. "Blue and white camper. Nice lady. Keeps to herself." Frank thanked him, and walked slowly toward the indicated vehicle. It was modest, compact and weathered, but well cared for. A small potted plant, its blossoms drooping slightly from the mist, sat beside the door. Wind chimes tinkled softly. He paused at the steps, took another breath, and knocked gently. The door creaked open. A woman in her early 40s stood in the doorway, her blonde hair now streaked with threads of silver. Her face, though kind, wore the quiet weight of time, lines carved by grief, solitude and the fading light of youth. Her eyes narrowed, polite but confused. "Can I help you?" Frank hesitated for a moment, and then said, "Amy, it's Frank Sanders, Alicia's father." A silence fell between them. Her expression shifted, first surprise, then recognition, then something deeper, a painful softness in her eyes. "Oh my God," she murmured, stepping back to open the door wider. "Mr. Sanders, please come in." Inside, the camper was surprisingly warm and inviting. The space was small but filled with thoughtful touches: knit blankets, framed photos, potted herbs on the sill, a pair of teacups sat on the counter next to a small electric kettle, one still half filled with forgotten tea. "Please, sit," she offered, motioning to a cushioned bench seat beside the built-in dining table. "Can I make you some coffee?" "Coffee would be great," Frank replied quietly, settling in. Amy busied herself with the kettle. Her hands moved with care but were slightly unsteady. Frank noticed the framed photo on the shelf above the table. It was of two teenage girls, one unmistakably Alicia. Both were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, laughter caught forever in the stillness of film. After a few minutes, Amy placed a steaming mug in front of Frank and sat down across from him. "What brings you here after all this time?" she asked, her voice soft, searching. Frank reached into the canvas bag beside him and carefully pulled out the yearbook. "I was going through Alicia's things this morning. We finally decided it was time to face it all. I came across this," he said, placing the book on the table. "I realized I'd never looked through it before, not once. It was just too painful. Amy nodded slowly. Her fingers reached out and gently touched the yearbook's cover. I remember that year, she said quietly. We were all so hopeful back then. Frank flipped to Alicia's profile page and pointed at the inscription. She mentioned a book, The Secret Garden. Said she lent it to you. Do you remember? Amy's lips parted slightly as she read the note. Her eyes moistened. Yes, I do. It was one of her favorites. She stood suddenly and walked over to a cabinet under her bed. Kneeling down, she opened a drawer and reached inside. After rummaging for a moment, she pulled out a worn hardcover book, the illustrated edition of The Secret Garden. I kept forgetting to return it, she said, her voice cracking. She always teased me about that. After she disappeared, I couldn't give it up. It's all I had left of her. She held the book close, almost like a living thing. Would you mind if I kept it? She asked. It's precious to me. Frank gave a gentle nod. Of course. It belongs with someone who loved her. Amy sat again, the book resting in her lap. She looked up, eyes distant. She was the best friend I ever had. The kind of person who saw the good in everyone, even when they didn't deserve it. Frank tilted his head. What do you mean? Amy hesitated. Alicia asked me questions back then, about someone. Frank leaned forward. Jason Murray. The name landed like a stone in Frank's gut. He searched his memory. Jason, he was in your class? Amy nodded. He was already modeling in high school. Had that slick charm. A little too smooth if you ask me. I remember hearing Elaine once said something about you dating him, Frank said. Amy's expression turned sharp. That's not true. I never dated Jason. I didn't even like him. He made people uncomfortable sometimes. Alicia and I talked about it. We agreed to steer clear. Frank was quiet for a moment. So why did she mention him? What was she asking? She asked me once if I thought someone like Jason could change. Amy said slowly. Said maybe people just needed someone to believe in them. She even asked me to drive past his house once. I thought it was strange, but Alicia was compassionate. She wanted to believe the best. Frank's brow furrowed. Did the police ever ask you about this? Yes. I told them. They questioned everyone. But by then Alicia was dating Brandon Knox. They focused on him, not Jason. Frank nodded, remembering Brandon's name. He came around the house a few times. We didn't like him much, but he had an alibi, cleared back then. Amy looked down at the book in her hands, running her fingers across the embossed cover. She never talked about Jason again after, but she used this book a lot, used to leave little notes in it, press flowers inside the pages. Frank took a breath. Would it be all right if I looked through it? Amy handed it over gently. Frank opened the book. The pages were worn. The spine cracked. As he flipped through, something fluttered out. A torn piece of glossy paper. He caught it before it hit the floor. It was a magazine clipping. An old photo shoot of teenage models. A boy in trendy clothing stood in the center. Frank stared. There was something familiar about the face. Who is this? He asked. Amy leaned over. That's Jason. Jason Murray. This was one of his first modeling gigs. Frank turned the yearbook toward her, flipping to the section near Alicia's page. There it was. Jason's senior photo. Amy said quietly. He has a fashion brand now. Still models occasionally. Still lives in town, I think. Frank stared at the photo again. He had never once heard Alicia mention Jason. He looked up at Amy. You said Alicia kept this page in her book. Why? Amy thought for a moment. It came from her favorite magazine. But I hated Jason. And Alicia in her way just said, nothing better to do with it than use it as a bookmark. Like a joke. But now I'm not so sure. Frank was quiet for a long beat. Then he asked, do you still have contact with him? Amy shook her head. No, but our high school class had a reunion last weekend. At Jason's house. I didn't go, but they shared the address in the group chat. She reached for her phone and showed Frank the message. Would you mind sending that to me? He asked. Amy forwarded the information. Frank, do you think he might have been involved? Frank stood slowly, the yearbook under one arm, The Secret Garden in the other. I don't know, he said, but something's pulling me in his direction. Something I can't ignore. As he stepped back outside into the cold, Frank glanced up at the overcast sky. The fog had thickened again. The sea somewhere beyond the trees roared softly. A part of him told him to stop now, to go home to Elaine to close this chapter as they had promised. But another part older, deeper told him the past wasn't finished with him yet. The drive back to Greyhaven was quiet, but Frank's mind roared louder than the engine beneath him. The address Amy had sent him glowed on the screen of his phone, a beacon pulling him forward, not just toward a house, but toward the edge of something buried and unfinished. The name Jason Murray hadn't crossed his lips in over 2 decades, but now it echoed in his thoughts like an unanswered question, stirring memories that never quite belonged to him, memories whispered to Alicia and buried before they ever reached his ears. Why hadn't Alicia mentioned him? Why was a torn magazine page with Jason's face tucked inside her favorite book? Why now, after all these years, was that name surfacing again? Frank didn't know what he was expecting, but whatever it was, it had waited long enough. 20 minutes later, he found himself in one of Greyhaven's more affluent neighborhoods. Here the houses stood tall and polished, with manicured lawns, motion-triggered lights, and gates that slid open without a sound. The address Amy had given led to a sprawling 2-story property at the end of a curved cul-de-sac. A circular driveway hugged a neatly trimmed garden. The landscaping was professionally done, rose bushes perfectly pruned, hedges shaped like waves. Jason Murray had done well for himself. Frank parked across the street, far enough to watch unnoticed. He sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm his nerves. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel. The yearbook sat in the passenger seat once more. Just a glance, a conversation maybe, a face to a name. Then the front door opened. A man stepped out. Even after 22 years, Frank recognized him instantly. The hair was shorter, more refined, the jawline sharper, but the walk, the posture was unmistakable. Jason Murray, the high school model, now every bit the image of a man who knew how to wear confidence like a tailored suit. He was laughing, talking to a woman beside him, young, well-dressed. She stepped into her car, kissed his cheek, and drove off with a smile. Jason turned toward the house, but stopped. His eyes scanned the street. They landed on Frank. Frank froze. Their eyes locked, just for a second, but in that second, Frank saw something shift in Jason's expression. The easy smile vanished. The posture stiffened. Jason squinted. Suspicion crept into his features. He took a step forward. Frank knew the moment had passed for subtlety. He opened the car door, stepped out, and raised a hand in greeting. "Good afternoon," he called out, trying to keep his voice level. "Jason Murray." Jason didn't smile. He didn't wave. He narrowed his eyes and replied curtly, "Who are you? Why are you watching my house?" Frank took a few steps forward, staying on the sidewalk. "My name is Frank Sanders," he said. "I'm Alicia Sanders' father. She was in your graduating class." Jason's expression didn't change. If anything, his eyes darkened. "I remember," he said flatly. "What do you want?" Frank hesitated. The tone was off. Cold. Too controlled. "I was hoping to talk. Just a few minutes. About Alicia." Jason folded his arms. "Why?" Frank motioned toward the yearbook under his arm. "She mentioned you once, and I found a bookmark, a page with your photo." Jason didn't look down. "So what?" Frank studied him closely. "I'm just looking for answers. It's been 22 years and we still don't know what happened to her." Jason's mouth tightened. "And you think I do?" "I think you knew her better than I realized." Jason scoffed. "I barely knew her. We weren't close. I never dated her. I told the police that back then. I don't appreciate being interrogated again." Frank's jaw clenched. He hadn't said anything about dating. "I never said you did," he replied carefully. "Just that I'd like to know what you remember." "Anything really?" Jason shook his head. "I've moved on. I've built a life. I don't want to dredge up old rumors." Frank took a breath. "I'm not spreading anything. I'm just a father looking for something to hold on to." "Anything." Jason took a step back, toward his door. "If we ever talked, it was because I borrowed homework. That's it. I returned what I borrowed." There was no drama, no romance, no friendship. But Frank saw it, the subtle flicker of something behind Jason's eyes. Not fear, not guilt, something messier. Anger, contempt. "Look, I don't want you outside my house again," Jason said sharply. "This is my home, my life, and I won't have it disrupted because you're chasing ghosts." He turned and walked to the door, his movements tight, controlled. Frank stood there for a long moment, heart pounding, the air thick with the scent of rose petals and something sour underneath. He had come looking for answers. Instead, he found a wall, a cold, polished, too perfect wall, And that, more than anything Jason had said, was what made Frank suspicious. Back in his car, Frank sat with both hands gripping the steering wheel. Jason's reaction hadn't been normal. Not for someone who had barely known Alicia. Not for someone with nothing to hide. Frank's eyes drifted to the address Amy had texted. He clicked on it again. The map app opened. He zoomed in. There, just west of Greyhaven, Jason also owned a second property, a vacation cottage near the cliffs. Frank leaned back in his seat, the wheels in his mind turning faster now. He should go home. That was the promise. But home could wait. Answers couldn't. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden tint over the sea-drenched landscape of Greyhaven. Long shadows stretched across the pavement, and the gulls overhead cried in circles, their calls sharp and fleeting like whispers of warning. Frank sat behind the wheel of his car, parked at the edge of the affluent neighborhood where Jason Murray lived. The unease that had settled in his chest during their conversation had not left, it had only thickened, pressing deeper with every breath. Jason's reaction hadn't been right. Not for someone innocent. Not for someone with nothing to hide. Frank's eyes drifted to his phone again. He tapped the address Amy had shared. The second property. A cottage near Whitlow Cliff. A part of town where the trees grew thick, and the coastline dropped dramatically into the sea. A place Alicia had loved to hike. A place of beauty and silence. He tapped the steering wheel. Just a quick drive, he told himself. Just to see. He turned the key and pulled away from the curb, leaving Jason's house, and the uneasy tension behind it in the rearview mirror. The road toward Whitlow Cliff curved gently through the wood. Patches of light flickered through the tall evergreens. The deeper he drove, the quieter the world became, until only the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt and the occasional sigh of wind through the trees accompanied him. Eventually, he reached the turnoff. A gravel path led down to a small cottage perched near the cliff's edge, partially hidden by a grove of pines. Frank slowed, heart thudding. He didn't pull all the way in. Instead, he parked just beyond view and walked the rest of the way through the underbrush, keeping his steps light. He crouched behind a tree, eyes on the cottage. The front door was open. Jason was there. Frank's breath caught as he watched Jason step outside carrying a wooden box in one hand and a shovel in the other. He moved with purpose, not like someone doing yard work, but like someone performing a ritual. Jason placed the box in a small garden trolley. Alongside it, he added a large plastic jug of water and a bouquet of flowers, white hyacinths, Alicia's favorite. Frank's stomach turned. Jason began walking slowly, following a narrow dirt path that led away from the cottage and toward the cliffs. Frank waited until he was out of view before following quietly, weaving between trees and shrubs, his shoes barely making a sound on the pine needle-covered ground. The path opened into a secluded overlook, a natural clearing at the cliff's edge. Below, the Pacific churned in silver and navy waves, endlessly crashing into the jagged rocks far below. Frank crouched behind a rock formation, hidden but close enough to see. Jason set down the box. The shovel bit into the earth. Again and again. The soil was resistant, dry, rocky, but Jason worked steadily, sweat gathering at his brow. He paused only once to scan the surrounding trees as though checking for shadows watching him. Then he knelt beside the hole, opened the wooden box, and began pulling out papers, letters, photographs. Maybe. Frank couldn't make out what was written, but Jason stared at each piece like it hurt to remember. Yet he couldn't look away. The bouquet was placed beside the box. Jason stared into the hole and murmured something. A gust of wind rose suddenly, catching the edge of a paper. It slipped from Jason's grip and spiraled into the air, catching the light before drifting off the cliff's edge. Jason cursed and quickly closed the box, scrambling to gather the other pages. Once everything was collected, he placed the box and the flowers gently into the hole. Then, with measured care, he filled it. Frank's breath trembled. It looked like a grave. There was no marker, no cross, no stone. But the way Jason smoothed the dirt, poured water over it, and stood silently over the fresh mound, it felt like a burial. Jason stood motionless for a long moment. The wind tugged gently at his shirt. The ocean roared behind him. Then Jason said softly, "I think you can hold these memories now, Alicia." Frank's entire body went rigid. He almost gasped aloud but clamped a hand over his mouth. He had heard it, clear as day. Her name. Alicia. Jason had said her name over what looked disturbingly like a grave. A pebble shifted beneath Frank's shoe. It tumbled down the rock, and struck a branch with a sharp snap. Jason's head snapped up. His eyes scanned the clearing. "Hello?" he called out, voice sharp and alert. "Is someone there?" Frank froze. He ducked lower, heart pounding in his chest. The silence seemed to stretch forever. Jason took a few steps toward the trees. Another, then another. Frank pressed himself into the shadow of the rock. Jason stood still, shovel still in his hand, listening. Then he muttered to himself, "Just the wind," and turned back toward the path. Frank didn't move until he heard Jason's footsteps fading, replaced by the rustle of the trolley wheels rolling back toward the cottage. When he was certain Jason was gone, Frank exhaled shakily. He waited another full minute, then emerged slowly from hiding. He stepped into the clearing. The soil was still fresh. He walked to the mound, his hands trembling. The bouquet of white hyacinths was buried just beneath the surface. Alicia's name echoed in his ears. Jason had spoken to her, like she was still listening, or maybe like he had finally told her goodbye. Frank's gaze drifted out toward the ocean, then back to the earth. Something was hidden here, and it was time to find out what. Frank didn't move for several moments. He stood at the cliff's edge, the ocean breathing below him like a restless beast, and stared at the freshly covered mound of earth. The bouquet of white hyacinths peeked through the damp soil, bright, fragrant, too deliberate to be a coincidence. Alicia's name still echoed in his mind. "I think you can hold these memories now, Alicia." Jason had said it with reverence, or guilt, maybe both. Frank looked around. The clearing was silent now, but the air held tension like the earth itself was waiting for something to be uncovered. He backed away slowly, his thoughts racing. He needed help. He needed this to be handled right. He returned to his car in a daze, hands cold despite the heat still trapped beneath his jacket. He opened the door, dropped into the seat, and stared at his phone. Detective Ron Keller, retired yet, but still in Grey Haven, still willing. Frank hoped to listen. He dialed, voicemail. Frank left a message, his voice tight and urgent. "Ron, it's Frank Sanders. I may have found something to do with Alicia." He hung up. Then he looked at the address Amy had sent him again. Jason Murray's name was typed cleanly above it. Frank's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. He should go home. He had promised Elaine they would finally let go, move on. But something inside him, a deeper instinct than grief, told him this was no coincidence. Jason had been hiding something, and now, after all this time, he was burying it in the ground. 20 minutes later, Frank found himself back in town. He pulled into the parking lot of the Grey Haven Memorial Funeral Home, not because he was ready to plan anything, but because he needed a place to think. He walked inside, greeted by the cool hush of polished tile and flower-scented air. A receptionist with kind eyes handed him a brochure and offered a quiet space to sit. Frank accepted both and walked outside again after only a few minutes. He didn't have the heart for arrangements, not yet. As he stepped into the lot, something across the street caught his eye. Jason, there he was, stepping out of a hardware store, shovel-less now, but carrying a small wooden box under one arm. His expression was unreadable, and his movements were brisk, almost nervous. Frank ducked behind a parked car. Moments later, Jason stepped into a florist's shop. When he emerged, he carried a bouquet, white hyacinths. Again, Frank's breath caught. What were the odds? He climbed quickly into his car as Jason pulled away from the curb. Without thinking, he started the engine and followed, staying several car lengths behind. Jason took the coastal road again, the one leading out to Whitlow Cliff. The journey passed in silence, every curve of the road drawing Frank deeper into unease. Jason turned onto the same private path as before, leading toward the cottage. But this time, Frank didn't stop short. He drove just past, parked behind a cluster of trees, and crept back on foot. From the cover of the woods he watched. Jason unlocked the cottage door, stepped inside, then reappeared moments later with a gallon jug of water. He loaded it into the same trolley as before, along with the box and the fresh bouquet. Then, with practiced ease, he followed the narrow trail toward the clearing. Frank waited, counted, then moved. He made his way back to the overlook, slower this time, more careful. He took a different route, looping behind a boulder-strewn ridge, and peering through a cluster of wind-swept pines. Jason was already digging. This time, the ritual seemed even more deliberate. The new bouquet rested beside the hole. The wooden box lay open, papers fluttering slightly in the breeze. Jason pulled out what looked like a folded letter and read silently. His lips moved, though Frank couldn't hear the words. Then came another gust. One of the papers slipped from the box and drifted toward the rocks near the edge. Jason lunged, grabbed it just in time. He let out a curse, then hurried to seal the box. He laid the flowers on top and began covering it again with soil. Frank's pulse pounded. It was the same spot, the same makeshift grave, and now a second burial. Whatever Jason was hiding, it wasn't just memories. When the final patch of earth was smoothed over and Jason stood up, he whispered something again, but this time Frank couldn't make it out. The wind was stronger, the waves below louder. Jason stayed a moment longer, standing over the site with his head bowed. Then he turned back toward the path. But something had changed in his body language. His stride was stiffer, more guarded. Frank ducked as Jason passed within feet of his hiding place, pushing the empty trolley back toward the cottage. Frank waited until Jason had disappeared completely before moving. This time, he didn't hesitate. He approached the mound and knelt beside it, running his fingers over the moist, newly packed soil. The white petals from the hyacinths trembled in the wind. He scanned the perimeter, made sure Jason was still inside, and then rose. He crept down to the cottage, and there, propped casually against the siding, was the shovel. Jason had left it behind. Frank picked it up, the handle worn and smooth. He walked back to the grave site, the weight of it, unfamiliar but necessary, in his hands. And then he began to dig. The first few inches gave easily, then came roots, then clay, but eventually he reached the hyacinths. He set them aside carefully, and then his shovel struck wood. The box. Frank dropped to his knees and brushed dirt from the top. His hands trembled. He was about to open it when a voice behind him made the blood in his veins go cold. I knew someone was out there. Frank spun around. Jason stood a few yards away, his face flushed and tense. One hand clenched into a fist. His breath came in shallow gulps. You shouldn't have come back. Frank stood slowly, shovel still in hand but his arms weak. I heard you say her name, he said, voice tight. What have you buried here, Jason? What does Alicia have to do with this? Jason stepped closer. His eyes had changed. The polished calm was gone. What replaced it was raw, cracked and dangerous. You don't know what you're doing, Jason hissed. You have no idea what this is about. Frank didn't back down. Then tell me. Jason said nothing. So Frank bent down and touched the box. I'm going to find out. Stop, Jason barked. Frank froze. Jason pulled something from his coat. A gun. Drop the shovel, Jason said, his voice cold and shaking. Frank did. The metal clattered on the rocks. But his other hand slipped into his pocket. He pulled out his phone. I'm calling the police, he said. You can shoot me, but I'm one button away. Jason lunged forward, striking the phone from Frank's hand. It skidded across the clearing, stopped just short of the cliff's edge. No, Frank shouted. Jason raised the gun again. Frank acted on instinct. He kicked, sending the gun flying into the air. It soared over the edge, vanished into the sea. Jason roared, his hands clenching into fists, and charged. Frank scrambled for the phone, fingers just brushing it. Jason tackled him. They went down hard. Frank gasped as Jason's hands wrapped around his throat. I should have done this 22 years ago, Jason snarled. Frank couldn't breathe. Stars exploded in his vision. Then, sirens. Far off. Then closer. Jason's grip faltered. Frank wrenched free, coughing, rolling away just as red and blue lights flared through the trees. Hands where we can see them, shouted an officer's voice. Jason froze. Several officers burst through the clearing, weapons drawn. Step back. Now. Jason dropped his hand. The shovel hit the ground again. He didn't resist. 2 officers pinned him to the earth, cuffing his wrists, reading his rights. Frank slumped to the ground, coughing, gasping, as one of the officers rushed to help him. You all right, sir? He nodded, barely, then pointed to the box. There. He just buried that. And he said her name. The officer's face darkened. Alicia Sanders. Frank nodded again. The officer turned, already calling in the name. Get Ramirez. and tell the team we've got something big. The clearing at the edge of Whitlow Cliff had become something else entirely. What once seemed like a secluded sanctuary tucked away in the folds of the Oregon coastline now resembled a crime scene from a long-buried nightmare. The air hung heavy. The wind had calmed as if the world itself were holding its breath. Frank sat on a large flat rock just outside the taped perimeter, a thermal blanket draped over his shoulders. His throat ached from Jason's grip, but his focus never strayed from the wooden box now resting on a blue tarp in front of the investigators. Flashlights cut through the fading afternoon light. Officers moved with quiet urgency. A crime scene photographer clicked steadily, capturing every angle. 2 paramedics hovered nearby, keeping an eye on Frank but respecting his silence. Detective Carmen Ramirez arrived just minutes after Jason's arrest. She was young, mid-30s, but carried herself with the gravity of someone who had spent too much time looking into the darkest corners of people's lives. Her dark hair was tied back tightly. Her badge gleamed beneath her coat. She approached Frank calmly. "You're Frank Sanders." He nodded slowly. "Yes." She held out his phone. "We found this near the cliff. Looks like you tried to call for help." "I pressed SOS," he murmured. "I didn't know what else to do." "You did the right thing," Ramirez said. "I've read your daughter's file." Alicia Sanders. "I was in high school myself when she went missing. Everyone in Greyhaven remembers." Frank didn't speak. He didn't need to. Detective Ramirez turned to the forensics team. "Open the box." Carefully. Everyone stepped back. The lead technician, a gray-haired man named Hughes, kneeled beside the box, snapped on a fresh pair of gloves, and released the latch with practiced ease. The lid creaked open. A low gasp broke the silence. Inside were several neatly stacked items. A bundle of handwritten letters, aged and yellowed at the corners. A stack of printed text messages, some smudged, some underlined. A handful of photographs, many faded but still legible, and tucked gently at the bottom, a small handmade doll, the kind a child might craft in an art class. Yarn hair, stitched eyes, a red ribbon tied around its neck. The room seemed to tilt. Frank leaned forward. "That doll. Alicia made one like that in elementary school. I remember. She showed it to me." Ramirez's voice lowered. "We'll preserve everything, but we need to know what's here." Hughes picked up the letters one by one, glancing through each briefly, then setting them into evidence bags. One stood out. The envelope was addressed in Alicia's handwriting. "To Jason," Ramirez read aloud, softly, "not for drama, but for understanding. Jason, I want to believe you. I've always wanted to, but I'm scared. Sometimes you say things that don't make sense, and I don't know if you're joking or not. I can't be the person who saves you if you don't want to be saved. I want to help, but I can't do this alone anymore." She stopped, eyes scanning the rest. Then she turned to the photos. Frank stood unsteadily, ignoring the protests from a paramedic, and moved to her side. He looked down and froze. The first photograph showed Alicia, unmistakably younger, sitting in what looked like the same cottage Jason had emerged from hours earlier. She was smiling faintly, but her expression seemed off, tired, guarded. The second photo was dark. Alicia, again, this time with her hands visibly tied, her eyes rimmed red, as if she'd been crying. Frank turned away, his breath catching. Ramirez quickly shielded the remaining images. One photo had writing on the back. Hughes read it aloud. "You must still love me. You must still love me. You must still love me." Written over and over again, dozens of times, in increasingly messy scrawl. Another had a note in Jason's handwriting. "Had a great time at the cliffs with you. Yours, Jay." Frank's hands were shaking. Why would he keep these? "For over 20 years, Ramirez answered carefully. "Because obsession doesn't age. It doesn't expire. It festers." An officer approached. "Detective, we found something." She turned. The officer led her and Frank further into the woods, no more than 15 feet from the clearing. "There's a spot with disturbed soil," the officer said. "It's not fresh, but it's not natural either." We started digging. Ramirez nodded. "Show me." Frank followed, heart sinking with every step. The digging site was smaller than a grave, but deep enough to conceal something long hidden. As the soil was pulled away, small fragments began to emerge. A brittle scrap of denim, a lock of tangled hair, a tiny femur, Unmistakably human. Frank's knees buckled. The paramedic caught him this time. He didn't cry. Not yet. Ramirez crouched beside the opening. We'll bring in the anthropologist. But I'd bet my badge this is Alicia. Frank whispered. You'll confirm it? Ramirez nodded. With DNA. But yes. I believe this is her. He nodded back. Numbly. A gust of wind passed through the trees, shaking the canopy above. For 22 years the forest had kept its secret. No longer. Back at the clearing, Jason sat in the back of a police cruiser, hands cuffed, face blank. Ramirez approached the vehicle. She didn't open the door. Jason Murray, she said through the glass. You are being charged with obstruction of justice, unlawful disposal of human remains, and suspicion of homicide pending full forensic analysis. Jason said nothing, didn't blink, just stared straight ahead. His lips barely moved, but Frank could read them. She was mine. The lights in the Greyhaven Police Department's evidence room buzzed faintly overhead, as Detective Ramirez carefully laid out the contents of the wooden box on a stainless steel table. The room was cold, not just physically, but emotionally sterile, the kind of place where every object held the weight of a story someone would rather forget. Frank sat silently nearby, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the small handmade doll that once belonged to Alicia. It was fraying at the edges, the yarn hair tangled, the fabric pale with age, but it was unmistakably hers. She made that in second grade, Frank murmured, voice dry. I remember she wanted to be a puppeteer for a whole month after. Said the doll had a name. May. Ramirez, who stood across from him with gloved hands, glanced down at the doll, then back to the piles of letters, notes and photographs. She kept everything, didn't she? Frank nodded. She wasn't just sentimental. She had a memory for people, even the ones who didn't deserve it. For hours, Ramirez and her team had worked to catalog each piece of evidence recovered from the burial site near Wicklow Cliff. The narrative that unfolded was both clearer and more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The letters dated back to the spring of 1989, a full year before Alicia vanished. They revealed a secret relationship between Alicia and Jason Murray. It was short-lived, only a few months, but intense in ways neither of her parents had ever known. Jason, popular and already modeling part-time, had taken an interest in Alicia during their junior year. Alicia, kind and open-hearted, had been flattered, but even in her own words there were red flags early on. Ramirez read aloud from a letter Alicia had written, but never said. He says he doesn't want anyone to know about us. Says I'm too innocent for his world. I don't think that's love. But maybe I just don't understand what love is supposed to feel like yet. Frank stared at the letter, emotion twisting in his chest. She never told us. Never said a word. Ramirez's expression was grim. Predators don't always need violence to manipulate, just silence. The messages grew darker over time. Jason had isolated Alicia, asking her not to tell Amy, not to tell her parents, not to speak to Brandon Knox, who had started showing interest in her during senior year. Eventually, Alicia did pull away. One final message, printed from what appeared to be an old AOL chat log, stood out. I don't want to see you anymore, Jason. I don't feel safe. Please leave me alone. But Jason hadn't left her alone, not even close. Another letter, this one scribbled in a spiral notebook page, written in all capital letters, had been kept inside the box. If I can't have you, no one can. The letters and notes gave way to photos, some clearly taken without Alicia's consent. Her face was tired, guarded, sometimes afraid. In one she was lying on a worn mattress in what Ramirez now confirmed was the same cliffside cottage. Her wrists were bound, but not tightly, as if Jason believed this wasn't restraint, but devotion. Ramirez turned the photos over one by one. Many had messages. One, dated just 2 days before Alicia's disappearance, simply read, "She said she was going to leave me. She doesn't understand what that means. I can't let her go." Frank closed his eyes. I didn't know she was going through the—" Ramirez gently rested her hand on the table. None of us did. The forensic team had also found fragments of Alicia's clothing in the burial site, most notably, her prom dress. Alicia had gone missing just weeks after prom night, and though police at the time had suspected her boyfriend Brandon Knox, his alibi had been solid. Jason, meanwhile, had been seen attending a fashion event in Portland,
At least that's what he had told people. Newly uncovered receipts found during a police search of his properties told a different story. He'd never left town that weekend. Ramirez stood before a whiteboard in the briefing room, the evidence now arranged in timeline form. "Here's what we believe happened," she said to Frank, and to the two officers present. "Alicia tried to end things. Jason convinced her to meet one last time, maybe to return the doll or some letters, or to talk." Frank nodded. She would have said yes. She believed in closure. Ramirez continued. "She goes to the cottage. He doesn't let her leave, keeps her for days, maybe longer. There are signs she was alive there. Food wrappers, handwritten notes, even a pressed flower Alicia likely brought." Frank's voice was almost inaudible. "She loved white hyacinth," said they meant sincerity. Ramirez paused. "The day she disappeared, there was a storm. No one was hiking the cliffs. No one to see what happened next." She pointed to the forensic photos. There was a struggle, signs of blunt force trauma on the blood on a stone inside the cottage fireplace. She fought him. The room was silent. No one moved. Ramirez stepped forward and placed a sealed evidence bag on the table. Inside was a single folded page. "We found this in the box, slipped inside the back cover of the secret guard. It's a note Jason wrote after the fact." She unfolded it and read. "She left me no choice. She wouldn't listen, wouldn't understand. I kept her safe, for as long as I could, but she was going to ruin me. I had to bury it. I had to bury her, and I had to bury all of it before it buried me." Frank stood slowly. His voice broke as he said, "So he buried the truth." Ramirez nodded. "But now finally, it's come to light."
Greyhaven was quiet that evening. When Elaine arrived at the cliffside scene, her hands trembled as she stepped from the car, clutching a small purse like a lifeline. Frank met her at the edge of the cordoned-off clearing, his face pale, eyes haunted but steady. She reached for his hand, and together, they stood silently, watching the forensic team continue their careful work beneath the fading light. Inside a tent pitched near the excavation, experts worked meticulously to recover every fragment. Alicia's remains were fragile and incomplete, but the science was certain. After hours of DNA testing, the preliminary report came back. Detective Ramirez returned to the couple with the news. "We have confirmation," she said softly. "The remains are Alicia's." Elaine gasped, tears spilling freely. Frank's jaw tightened, swallowing a sob. For 22 years, they had lived in limbo. Now they finally knew. The community of Greyhaven responded with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Neighbors brought flowers to the Sanders' doorstep. The local newspaper ran a somber headline, "Missing Girl Found. Greyhaven's Longest Mystery Ends." Friends and classmates reached out, sharing memories and condolences. Amy Davidson visited often, her eyes red and voice trembling as she spoke of lost time and regret. But amid the grieving, the questions persisted. How had this happened? Could it have been prevented? And why had Jason Murray never been a suspect before? Detective Ramirez sat down with Frank and Elaine to explain. "Jason kept his past carefully hidden," she said. "No prior arrests, no criminal record, a respected member of the community. He'd built his life on a facade. When Alicia disappeared, everyone looked at Brandon Knox, her boyfriend at the time. But the truth was far darker." Elaine broke the silence. "How do you live with that? Knowing the person who hurt your daughter was so close, so part of her life?" Frank swallowed hard. "I don't know that we will. But now we can start. We can find some peace." Plans were made for a memorial, not a traditional burial but a ceremony by the sea where Alicia had found joy and where her spirit could finally be free. White hyacinths would be scattered on the waves. Alicia's ashes would be released into the ocean she loved. As the sun set over Greyhaven, Frank and Elaine stood on their porch. Between them was a framed photo of Alicia, not the formal senior portrait, but a candid shot, her hair wild in the breeze, laughter lighting up her face. Elaine whispered, "Maybe now we can finally move forward." Frank nodded. She was full of hope, so much like you. Elaine smiled sadly, and so stubborn. When she believed in someone, nothing could change her mind. They sat in silence, bound by grief and love. The day dawned crisp and clear over Greyhaven, a rare sunlit morning that seemed almost a blessing for the somber gathering ahead. A small flotilla of boats bobbed gently in the calm waters below Whitlow Cliff, their hulls casting reflections on the glassy surface of the Pacific. Frank and Elaine Sanders stood at the bow of the lead boat, their hands tightly clasped around a small, simple urn, the final resting place of their beloved Alicia. Beside them stood Amy Davidson, tears glistening on her cheeks, clutching the worn copy of The Secret Garden, a symbol of friendship, innocence, and the bittersweet passage of time. Detective Ron Keller, who had come out of retirement to support the family, stood quietly nearby, his face etched with the gravity of years spent searching for the truth. As the boats slowly moved away from the shore, a hush fell over the passengers, former classmates, teachers, neighbors, all united by grief and hope. A local minister stepped forward, voice gentle yet clear over the whispering wave. "Today, we gather to honor the memory of Alicia Sanders," he began. "For 22 years her absence weighed heavy on this community, on her family, and on all who loved her." He paused, letting the silence deepen. "Though her life was taken too soon, her spirit remains with us in the ocean she loved, in the hearts she touched, and in the legacy of hope she left behind." Frank and Elaine moved to the center of the bow. With a steady hand, Frank opened the urn. Together they scattered Alicia's ashes into the sea, watching as the wind carried them softly over the waves. White hyacinths followed, tossed from every boat, creating a delicate garden floating on the ocean's surface. Amy stepped forward, placing the secret garden gently on the water, whispering, "Goodbye, my friend. I'm sorry I never returned your book." The ceremony closed with quiet prayers and the gentle song of the ocean. As the boats returned to shore, Frank looked back toward the water, toward the vast endless sea where Alicia was finally free. Pain remained, but so did peace. A chapter closed, a family beginning to heal. That evening Frank and Elaine sat on their porch beneath a star-studded sky. The framed photo of Alicia rested between them. Elaine reached for Frank's hand. "We will remember her, not for the pain but for the light she brought." Frank squeezed her hand. She believed in the power of love to change the world. Maybe that was her greatest gift. Together they watched the night deepen over Greyhaven, and for the first time in many years, they allowed themselves to hope. In the sterile interrogation room of the Greyhaven Police Department, Jason Murray sat alone. The facade of the confident businessman had crumbled. His eyes, once sharp and guarded, now flickered with exhaustion and something closer to despair. Detective Ramirez entered, closing the door softly behind her. "Jason, we have the evidence. The photos, the letters, the burial site. It's all here." Jason swallowed hard, his fingers twitching nervously on the table. "You don't have to say anything," Ramirez continued. "But if you want to explain, if you want to tell your side, it's your chance." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Jason spoke, his voice low, strained. "I loved her. In my way, I thought I did." He looked down, rubbing his temples. "I was broken, and she saw something in me that no one else did. She wanted to help me change. I wanted that too." Jason's hands clenched. "But I wasn't strong enough. I didn't know how to be the person she needed." He paused, swallowing the weight of regret. "One day she told me she was done, that she couldn't be the one to fix me anymore." His voice cracked. "I didn't want to lose her. I thought if I kept her close, if I kept control, I could keep us both alive." Ramirez listened quietly as Jason continued. He confessed to holding Alicia captive in the cottage for days, desperate for her to stay, to forgive him, to love him despite his demon. He described the night of the struggle, the violent clash on the cliff's edge, when Alicia tried to escape. In his fury and fear he struck her repeatedly. When she fell silent, reality hit like a freight train. Panic overcame him. He buried her body, buried the truth, buried the memories he couldn't face. Detective Ramirez's voice was steady but gentle. "Jason, this is the moment to take responsibility, to help the family find peace." Jason nodded, tears tracking down his cheeks. "I want to tell them the whole story. I want to say I'm sorry." Outside the station, Frank and Elaine waited. When Ramirez approached, Frank's heart pounded. She told them of Jason's confession, of his tortured love, of the pain behind the tragedy. Elaine sobbed. Frank stood silent, the weight of 22 years lifting and settling anew. Jason Murray was charged with murder, unlawful confinement, and obstruction of justice. But for the Sanders family, the charges mattered less than closure. In the weeks that followed,
The small town of Greyhaven began its slow, tentative journey toward healing. For Frank and Elaine Sanders, the days were a mixture of raw grief and fragile hope. The mystery that had haunted them for over 2 decades was finally laid bare, but the ache of loss remained as deep as ever. They found strength in each other, and in the unexpected support of Amy Davidson. Amy became a steady presence, visiting often to share memories and to offer quiet comfort. "I never stopped thinking about her," Amy said one afternoon, sitting in the Sanders living room. "If I had known what she was going through, maybe things would have been different." Frank shook his head gently. "None of this is your fault." Alicia believed in seeing the good in people, even when it hurt her. Elaine smiled sadly. That's what made her so special and so vulnerable. The community organized memorials and gatherings, sharing stories of Alicia's kindness, her laughter and her compassion. Teachers recalled her curiosity and determination. Classmates remembered her as a beacon of warmth in their youth. Greyhaven, a town forever marked by tragedy, began to find a new way forward. Frank and Elaine visited the ocean often, the place where Alicia's ashes had been scattered. They stood hand in hand, watching the waves crash against the cliffs. "It's not about forgetting," Elaine said softly. "It's about remembering her light." Frank nodded. "She had a stubborn hope that the world could be better, and she made ours better too," Elaine replied. Though the pain would never fully fade, the Sanders family and their friends began to build a life around the memory of Alicia, a life filled with love, remembrance, and the quiet courage to heal. As darkness fell over Greyhaven, the first stars began to twinkle in the clear night sky, casting a gentle light on a town forever changed. Frank sat quietly on the back porch of the house where he and Elaine had raised Alicia, a house now filled with memories, pain, and finally, a fragile peace. Beside him rested a framed photograph, not the polished senior portrait from the yearbook, but a candid shot of Alicia laughing on the beach, her hair wild in the wind, her face alive with joy. Elaine settled beside him, her hand finding him. "I think we can finally move forward now," she whispered. "Not by forgetting her," Frank replied, "but by remembering her as she truly was, vibrant, loving, full of compassion." Elaine smiled softly. "She was so much like you. You know that desire to see the good in people, to help them be better." Frank chuckled quietly. "And she had your stubbornness. Once she decided someone was worth saving, nothing could change her mind." They sat together in companionable silence, their shared grief no longer a wall but a bond forged in love and resilience. Frank's voice broke the quiet at last. "I keep thinking about how young she was, how innocent. Despite everything, she believed in the power of love to transform people." Elaine squeezed his hand. "That's not a bad thing to believe in. The world needs more people willing to see the potential for good in others." Frank nodded slowly. "I just wish she'd told us about Jason. Maybe we could have helped her see the danger, but we'll never." Elaine's eyes softened with understanding. "Wherever she is now, she knows how much we loved her, and that we never stopped looking." The night stretched wide above them. Stars shimmered, timeless and steady, and in that vast, quiet sky, Frank felt a sense of peace. Alicia had been found. She was no longer lost to the unknown, but part of the sea she had loved, free and unconfined. Frank and Elaine would continue to live, to remember, and finally to heal.